everybody. Welcome back to RoguesCast.
Hello.
Bumblure here, and joining me today is Nosidda. And what I wanted to talk about today is the retro and classic game consoles that are now coming out. So, I know one of the first big popular ones that focused on doing retro games was the Retron.
The Retron series of consoles.
But that series of consoles actually plays the physical cartridge from these classic consoles. So now we're seeing a lot of these video game developers rolling out classic video game cartridges that are just a small portion of what was actually offered on a console that is now, optimized for HDMI and wireless controllers and other, modern innovations, but you're only getting a tiny snippet or a highlight of some of the quote-unquote best games of that console.
Yeah, because one issue that I take with the whole classic retro console craze is, okay, it's a cool item, and I love them. I have a SNES Classic at home, and I think it's really cool because I've never owned a SNES myself, personally. I did get a big Super Nintendo fix when I was a kid, but I never actually owned my own Super Nintendo.
Yeah.
And it's nice to have that now so that it's kind of like having my own Super Nintendo. But I also understand that there are a lot of games out there from that era that people grew up with that are fantastic games, but we're not getting on these retro consoles for various reasons, whether it be the developer's not around anymore, so the rights for it are all flippy floppy everywhere, etc., etc.
Yeah. So it's just, I wanted to just kind of talk about what we think are some of the benefits and drawbacks to these kind of consoles actually being developed. So let's start with some of the pros then.
Right.
So, like you mentioned, one of the really nice benefits is that people that might not have grown up with that console or were unable to have that console anymore, it broke, they had to sell it for financial reasons, or
right.
One thing led to another, and then they weren't able to have it anymore. Now they can go and get a little bit of that nostalgia of having now one of these retro classic consoles, and play some of those games that they may remember from a kid.
Yep.
And they don't have to hold on to all of these cartridges and physical media because it's all preloaded onto the system.
Yeah, and that's one thing I was actually going to say is that it's nice that, because I was wanting to get more retro games in my retro game collection, and so I at Retropalooza last year I actually bought a few NES and Super Nintendo games. But then they announced the Super Nintendo Classic later on down the line, and I ended up getting that. I'm just I just got a shit ton of SNES games in just one little package that I can just play whenever I want, and I don't have to insert any cartridges. So this is actually a really nice way to just get my own Super Nintendo along with just a huge library of classics all in one swoop. And I've been contemplating getting the NES Classic because I know the nearest Best Buy around me, they actually have a lot of NES Classics on hand right now. So I've been thinking about getting one, but with the Switch Online service being a thing now, that's kind of it kind of makes me think why do I need one?
And yeah, that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about whenever we get to the drawbacks. But I want to focus on some of the pros first.
Right.
So one of the things that it's kind of a middle ground for me is space. They help you save space in that everything is preloaded onto the system, so you don't have to actually have the cartridges. And some of those games that are preloaded onto the systems are worth a lot of money.
Yep.
They have risen in value since their original release.
Oh yeah, a lot. Especially games like Earthbound, for example, that. The value of that game is skyrocketed.
So it's just it's a great way that you can get your hands on some of these games, but you might not get a physical copy, but at least you can still enjoy the game. But the game isn't going to retain value because it's just data on a disc or hard drive, whatever they built into the system.
Yeah, which if you're just getting it to play the games,
Yeah,
I mean, that's perfectly fine.
That's great for you as the individual, but as for people that are collectors, it's not really what they're looking for.
Yeah, the collectors prefer to actually play these retro games in their like ultimate classic form.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and like I can definitely understand where they're coming from in that department, because when I want to play a retro game personally, I want to do it in some kind of official manner, whereas a lot of people are just like, you can emulate them and get high-res versions of them and you can hack them. I'm like, no, I want to play them as they originally were intended.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, you know, like the SNES Classic, for example. Sure, it's not the original cartridge, but it's still an officially licensed product.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so
and it's in the controller, like, while it may now be wireless, it's still the same default layout that the original controller was.
Oh, it's still wired, but yeah.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, like I mean, like emulation just doesn't have the same feel as like playing the game via retro style. Plus, it's nice being able to have the actual console on hand. Still, like I can understand why you would still want to have a Super Nintendo alongside your SNES Classic, because like take the N64 for example, because the N64 is my favorite game of all time, game system of all time. Excuse me. You know, a lot of people say there's going to be an N64 Classic, which we don't know yet, but who knows? By the time this comes out, they may have announced one, but who knows? But if they did come out with an N64 Classic, I would totally be all over that. But I would still want to keep my regular N64 plugged in, because there are games that I love on the N64 that I know there's no way they're going to be on the N64 Classic if it becomes a thing. Perfect example, Glover. I loved that game, and I have a copy of Glover at home. And sometimes I just feel like, you know what? That's a nice little classic game that I like. I'll boot it up. What are the chances do you think that they're going to put Glover on the N64 Classic? It's highly unlikely.
Yeah, and then there's other games like Conker's Bad Fur Day.
Oh yeah, they're not going to put that on.
There is no chance that would get on there.
And plus, a better example, Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie, two huge N64 classics. They are not going to put those on there because Microsoft owns them.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm not going to put it past them that they might be able to get something like that from a big company that's still around. But as you mentioned earlier, that there are some companies that were developers for, like, I think Hudson Soft is one that I remember from, like, I think the NES days.
Yeah, Hudson Soft, I know.
I think the logo was the bee.
Yeah, I think I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, it's just like a developer like that is just like trying to track down who has the rights to be able to license the game and then get it onto the system. Is just like, that's where one of the big drawbacks for me is for these retro consoles, is that you're going to get mostly games from the developer of the console. So like a Nintendo based classic console, you will get mostly Nintendo games.
Yeah, which there's some exceptions. I know the NES Classic, I think, has Castlevania on it.
Yeah.
So there's like, you know, that's a Konami game. So I mean, there's some exceptions, but for the most part, yeah, it's going to be mostly Nintendo games.
And that's the thing, is that that's still another big company that's around.
Right.
And they can make those kind of deals. But if we go into some of the smaller independent games that like third party and independent game developers, they're the ones getting like the biggest, I don't want to say like, you know, getting the shaft essentially, or the short end of the stick whenever it comes to these classic consoles, because either they're not around anymore or they don't have enough clout to get on board with the investment of making these classic consoles.
Right. And I think there was one classic console that came out last year that the idea behind it was absolutely brilliant, and I actually would like it if Sony and Nintendo could do something like this. Was it was just a poorly implemented idea. Was the Sega classic console?
Mm-hmm.
Like it wasn't anything like what Sony and Nintendo were doing with the mini classic consoles. What they did was they actually made like an actual sized Genesis console that, you know, supported HDMI, came packaged with a whole bunch of Genesis games, but it still had a cartridge slot for you to put Genesis games into and play them.
Yeah.
Now, the drawback for that, though, is that it was a cool idea, but it was horribly implemented because it was developed by At Games, and At Games has a terrible reputation for ruining Genesis systems. So, like, as a result, the game's just, like, the audio is way off cue. It sounds horrible. It lags a shit ton. So, like, yeah, like, I mean, good news is I think Sega's cutting ties with them soon, as far as I'm hearing, which will be a good thing.
Because as far as I know...
It's a good idea. It was just poorly implemented, and I would like to see that more.
Yeah, because as far as I know, all of the classic consoles that have come out are just preloaded with games, but they can't actually play the physical cartridges.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying, is that Sega and At Games had a cool idea that was poorly implemented, which is make the classic console that's prepackaged with games, but you still have the cartridge slot, so that way you can still enter in your own games that you already own.
So it's not a substitute for the original console.
Right, exactly.
And that's one of the things that, because we run our own YouTube channel for the people that may not watch our YouTube content, but just looking right here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 consoles.
This is going up on YouTube, but we got to let people know that we run a YouTube channel.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. So, well, I don't know. We might upload these somewhere else later. I don't know. But and then you also count in the PC. That's 10 different systems that can play video games that I have accounted for over the years, and these are all, mostly the original systems.
I'm going through my head and counting the ones I have.
And so it's just, if you also then now stack up the classic versions next to those, that's what, 5 more right now, and they're going to release even more.
I think in my house right now I have 12 video game consoles, but not all of them are connected to the TV.
And so it's just, you're either going to have to keep swapping out all these cables to play between all these classic systems because you only have so many HDMI ports, or you're going to have to buy a very expensive HDMI switcher so you aren't constantly having to swap between all of the inputs.
Yeah, no, I totally get that, because I have a GameCube and an N64 on my entertainment system at home, and they share the same video cable because I only own one video cable for them. So whenever I want to play the GameCube, fine, it's plugged in. But if I want to swap to the N64, I got to unplug the cable from the GameCube and plug it into the N64 because they both use the same cable.
Yeah.
But since I only have one of those cables, I have to plug it into the system I want to play.
Mm-hmm.
So just because I only have one cable, and plus the TV only has one composite port. Or one set of composite ports, because it's 3 ports, the white, red, and yellow. But yeah, like, it's just a whole bunch of swapping around. There's, like I said, the idea of having just the cartridge that allows you to play the games you already own is a neat idea. I think that's a better idea. I get the appeal of, oh, it's so tiny and it has all these little games, and it has all these awesome games on it. That's cool and all, but what about the other games that I own that I could also play?
Mm-hmm.
And what about those?
So it's just, if you're an avid video gamer, that's something that you would have to consider, is not only where am I going to put all of this stuff, but how often do I want to swap cables? Do I want to try and get the original cartridges? And then something else that you mentioned earlier was emulation.
Mm-hmm.
There are tons and tons of resources for emulation, and I know it's not technically legal, but it's also kind of one of those things that there hasn't really been a good way to archive all of these classic games for people to play. And with the classic consoles, it's essentially, it's for me, it's even less than a remake or a re-release of a game. Because they aren't even updating the graphics. They're just
re-releasing it.
They're just re-releasing it and making it HDMI compatible.
Yeah. I mean, they are adding some more features, though, like the SNES Classic. Like, you have the ability to, like, make save states and line and stuff like that, which that's cool and all, but I mean, I see what you're saying.
They're wholly necessary to the experience.
Yeah, like they're basically doing the same thing that the Retron 5 does. The Retron 5 does, excuse me.
Mm-hmm. But it's just, I've already, because I've managed to, and I've been blessed that I've been able to keep my video game collection from when I was a kid. So everything I've bought since I was a kid in terms of like video games, I still have, and it still works, and which is a miracle in and of itself.
That is a miracle, and you are insanely lucky for that, because there are so many games that I used to own as a kid that are gone now. Like my N64 collection. I remember I had like a collection of like 20 Nintendo 64 games.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one day I was trying to make room for like all these new game systems, and I hadn't played my N64 in a long time, and I was like 13 years old, and I was trying to be cool with all the new stuff. So I just put all my N64 cartridges in a box and put them somewhere. And years later I tried to go find that box again, and I could never fucking find it. So I don't know if there's just this box full of N64 games somewhere at my place that I just can't freaking find anywhere.
It's just still in your attic.
Like I've checked the attic too. Like I've checked everywhere where I possibly could think that I would put it, and it's nowhere to be found. So either it's just sitting somewhere completely unfound, or maybe when we were doing some like spring cleaning or something, we didn't even check the box to see what was in there. We just threw it out or whatever.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know what happened to those N64 games. So over the years, I've been having to rebuild my collection. So I think I have now eight or nine N64 games. Eight or nine of, well, like 7 of them are games that I actually had when I was a kid. But one of them is not, which was Conker's Bad Fur Day for obviously reasons.
But getting back to what I was saying is that, like, I've bought all of these games, and I have most of the games that I actually care about.
Yeah.
And so it's now, if I buy like the PlayStation Classic, or if they do release an N64 Classic, or
which I will jump all over if that happens,
the SNES or NES Classic, it's like most of the really cool games that they have on there, I already have in physical form, and I can still play on some of my other systems that I've already got set up. So for me personally, there's not a lot of value in the classic consoles.
Yeah, it's kind of based on a person by person basis, because like for me personally, if they announced an N64 Classic, which again, I don't know, like this podcast might come out after it's announced, so who knows, but if they did announce one, I mean, the N64 is my all-time favorite video game system, and I know I already own one, but I don't know, like there's just this idea of N64 games that I used to play and love, and I can play them via HD in just one system, and I don't have to keep swapping cartridges. Like, I don't know, there's just, for me personally, there is a little bit of an appeal there.
Yeah, there is a lot of appeal, and that's what I'm saying. I fall into a very specific group of gamer.
Right.
That is not the majority of people. I am definitely going to preface this with that. And so it's just like I was saying, for me personally, I don't see a lot of value in the classics because I still have all of my classics.
Yeah, and that's fine. You know, it's awesome that you still have all those games.
But if you're like limited on space and you don't want to try and get like a refurbished classic, like a refurbished original console, and then also go on top of it trying to actually track down the games that, and like some of them have fluctuated in value greatly, the classic releases of these consoles, the micro consoles, are great ways to essentially kind of scratch that itch.
Yeah, like the best example that I can think of is Earthbound. Because if you have a Super Nintendo, like an old school Super Nintendo, and you want to play Earthbound, guess what you got to do? You're probably going to have to pay like $300 to $400 to get that damn cartridge.
Yeah.
Versus
and that's not even factoring in a console to play.
Yeah. Versus just buying the Super Nintendo Classic for like what, $60, and you get Earthbound plus a whole bunch of others.
Yeah, and that's the kind of the weird spot is that I wanted to talk about with you, is that these games have fluctuated in value. Do you think that the titles on these consoles, even though they're just digitally, not physical copies, do you think that factors into the price point? Because we've seen the NES Classic and the SNES Classic come out, and they were, what, around $60?
Well, the NES Classic was cheaper probably because it had fewer games.
Mm-hmm.
And the NES Classic was notoriously more expensive, but it also had more games on it.
Yeah.
And it also had an unreleased game on it, which was Star Fox 2.
Yeah.
So there was that.
So how much more was that?
I
remember?
don't remember how much the NES Classic was. I know the SNES Classic was like, I think $60 or $80.
Yeah. And I think that one was kind of more of a proof of concept to see if it would work.
The NES one, I think.
Yeah. But I know I think the PlayStation Classic is coming out, and I think the last time I saw it was like they were saying it's going to be $100.
Yeah, it's going to be $100, which I think that's overpriced for that thing.
Because it's only got, I think, 20 games?
It's got 20 games on it, which is the same number as the SNES Classic, I believe. But $100 is a lot to ask for that thing.
PlayStation games are typically a lot longer than SNES and NES games.
Yeah, which okay.
So I think you will get more playtime out of it, but I do feel that for me it's overpriced because again, they're not getting a lot of because they're not going to get any collector's value out of the games. Mm-hmm. They're only going to get, nostalgia and playtime out of it. And they aren't going to update the graphics like they're doing with like remakes for like Shadow of the Colossus, Final Fantasy VII.
Right, they're literally just ports into ROMs.
Yeah, and that's another thing I want to talk about is just ports in general typically don't go well. It seems to be whenever a console goes to PC or PC goes to console that ports just break horribly.
It's because the systems like the infrastructures, that's the word I was looking for. The infrastructures are very different from each other because PCs are very basic in a way because like when you build a PC you're using raw components.
Yeah.
Whereas a console is extremely custom.
Yeah.
So it's like it's a different like Monster Hunter World was delayed on PC because they wanted to refine the PC version, which I can understand because when you develop a game for consoles, you're developing with one kind of piece of hardware in mind, whereas when you're developing for PC,
you have to factor in an extreme range.
There's literally millions upon millions upon millions of different hardware combinations out there that could be running this game, and you have to try and account for all of it.
Mm-hmm. And so that's definitely a check in the Classics box in that whenever you get it, I would hope that every game that is loaded on that system will work.
Yeah.
And I haven't heard of any cases of somebody getting a classic console and then a game not actually working.
I have never seen that happen. I mean, these classic consoles have been developed really well.
Yeah, so they definitely test them to make sure they work as intended.
Yeah, and that's a good thing.
And so that's something I definitely think is good for that market. But like I was saying, you don't get collector's value. You're only getting playtime and personal value out of it. Mm-hmm. But the other thing is that like some of the games are extremely valuable, like we talked about, like Earthbound. But I want to know what's the criteria for what they base for what games are going to be preloaded onto the system.
I don't know. I think the first thing they look at is just consumer feedback, like what games for that system were super popular. I think that's the first thing that they look at, and then the second thing they ask is, okay, great, what games are actually what games out of that list are actually possible?
Yeah,
you know what I mean. Like,
I think that should be the first thing is just like, do we know who owns the rights and can we get the rights?
Exactly. So. And I think that's why, most of the games you're going to see on these classic consoles, especially on the Nintendo end, most of them are going to be games that were made by Nintendo or published by Nintendo because of the fact that it's very easy for Nintendo to implement their own properties versus trying to get Castlevania in there. At that point, they got to contact Konami, and get the rights to do it from them.
Mm-hmm. And that was something I was thinking might have actually bumped up the price point for the PlayStation Classic is maybe they will have a lot more third-party development games on there.
That's exactly what I was thinking too, because if you really think about it, like Nintendo's classic consoles are primarily first-party games with a few third-party games included in there. PlayStation has always been about primarily third-party games.
Yeah, because
there's not a whole lot on the PlayStation side, at least in the PlayStation 1 era, that would be considered for a PlayStation Classic console that would be in-house.
Yeah, and the main ones that I can think of, like I believe Crash Bandicoot and Spyro were...
And they're Activision now.
And they're Activision?
Yeah, because they used to be in-house. Like back in the day,
Okay.
they were in-house, but Activision owns both Crash and Spyro now. So even with those games, Sony would have to go to third party and say, hey, we need to license these for the Classic.
But it's just like, I would think that those two, at least the first ones, would be like mandatory on a PlayStation Classic.
Oh, yeah, sure.
But here's the weird thing, though, is that we've already gotten announced that they're doing a Spyro remaster, and then the Crash Bandicoot Insane trilogy has already been launched.
Yeah, which makes me think that it makes me wonder if they actually are going to include those games
And
on there.
that's kind of the weird spot that we're in, is that we're getting games that are actually getting remastered, updated with graphics and modern functionality, and then you have this other group of preloaded consoles with the original data loaded on them, and it's just like, where do we make the distinction between the two?
Yeah, I definitely see where you're coming from there, because on one hand, if they were to put the Crash Bandicoot and the Spyro games on the PlayStation Classic, that's kind of interfering with that market of the remakes.
Exactly. And I'm going to be perfectly honest, the early days of 3D video games, in my opinion, graphically, have not aged well.
No, they haven't, because like that's the thing about. And I will give Sony this: the PlayStation Classic isn't going to come with the DualShock controller. It's going to come with the old school D-pad only controller.
Oh wow!
Like you remember the PlayStation controller that didn't have the analog sticks?
Yep.
That's the controller it comes with. So it seems to me like if that's the case, they're going to be looking more at games that were like less early 3D like, and more like
later life of the PlayStation.
Well, not later life of the PlayStation, but like games that you would play on the PlayStation that can still hold up even to this day. Like Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah.
Final Fantasy VII is a 3D game, a very early 3D game. But you know what? The only thing about it that's dated is just the look of it. Everything else works fine.
Mm-hmm.
Like in terms
I
of
like good old-fashioned Popeye arm cloud.
But like, I mean, aside from just the look of the graphics, the game hasn't aged badly.
Mm-hmm.
It's still the gameplay mechanics are still perfectly fine.
And that's the part that I think is just interesting with how games have aged, is that gameplay and the stories age well.
Yeah.
Whereas graphics are the only thing that might not age well.
Well, no, that's not entirely true, because gameplay can easily age badly.
Yeah.
I mean, like trust me, there are plenty of games that I think that were amazing back in the 90s, but if you were to go back and play them now, you'd be like, man, I am not used to these clunky controls.
I recently had that with GoldenEye.
GoldenEye is a perfect example, because
you only have one joystick.
Yeah, and it feels like that game feels horribly weird now. And I'll go with another example, and I might get some flack for this one, but let me clarify, this is one of my favorite games of all time, Ocarina of Time. I love the game, but if you go back and play it now, there are some things about its gameplay mechanics that it did not age well.
I think a lot of people's like past hate was the early days of camera.
Yeah.
Just because a lot of early day camera angles were not the best.
Well, I'm to reference I'm going to reference Aaron Hansen's sequelitis video that he did on Zelda. He mentioned that there's like you know those like little like sharp things that slide around the floor in Ocarina of Time?
Yeah.
Like he mentioned that you could easily be looking in one direction and that thing will just come flying out of nowhere and hit you.
Yeah.
Like that is a sign of early 3D. Because what they were trying to do there was they were implementing something from a 2D Zelda into a 3D environment without really changing it much.
Yeah.
And when it's in 3D, it doesn't work as well, because in 2D, it's an overhead view, so you can see it coming even if you're looking in the opposite direction. But in 3D, if you're looking in the opposite direction, you're not going to see it coming.
Yeah.
So I like things like that. Like there's some little design choices like that are a little bit outdated in some of those earlier 3D games. Like, don't get me wrong, Ocarina of Time is one of my favorite games of all time. and I still absolutely adore it, and I go back and replay it once in a while, and I still enjoy it. But there are things about it in terms of gameplay mechanics that haven't completely aged well.
Yeah, but even with a remaster and a re-release of the classic version, they aren't going to fix that.
No,
because
it's just going to be a
part of the game.
Yeah, no, they're going to port it, which that's fine. You know what? Like, people are like, if they did an N64 Classic, obviously they're going to put Ocarina of Time on there, and you know they're not going to change anything, which is fine. You know, like the game, like there might be some mechanics in that game that haven't aged well, but I mean, it's still a good game. You know, it doesn't like.
And like one of the things for me is like I think it was like Silent Hill and Resident Evil with the locked camera angles. Yeah. It's just like some people would feel that no, having the locked camera angles is a mandatory thing because that was the experience of the original thing. But if they went and remade it and made it to a free control camera, but everything still operated the way it was, would you be getting a better experience out of it than the original experience where you had the locked angle?
Well, at that point, it's
up to debate.
At that point, you're just the remake basically just becomes just a different take on that game than what was original. Like the Final Fantasy VII remake that's being made. You know, it's obviously it's a remake of Final Fantasy VII. But when you look at the gameplay that they've shown so far, it's obvious that they're doing something completely different with it.
Yeah, because at last I heard that they're going to completely remove the turn-based strategy and go with a live action.
Yeah,
combat.
it's not going to be turn-based. It's going to be more like. Actually, when I was looking at the gameplay, because they did show gameplay of it. It was a while ago, but they did show gameplay from it, and the battle system actually looks a lot like Kingdom Hearts in a way.
Huh.
And I was like, you know what? That's not exactly a bad idea. Like, I would not be against it if they did something like that.
I'm curious to follow the development of that game, but I think we're getting a little off topic.
We are.
But one of the things I did want to put as a big plus to these classic consoles is online support.
I don't think the classic consoles have that. I know the Switch Online has
really?
that, but
I thought they would have.
I don't think so. No, Switch Online does.
Well, that seems like a huge oversight then, because I feel like a lot of these classic consoles would have very classic multiplayer games.
I mean, you still do multiplayer. Obviously, they come with two controllers, but in terms of playing them online, no, I don't think they've
playing
done that.
them online, like with friends that have also like the classic consoles, would just seems like it should be something that you would naturally want to include. And maybe they're just going with the portability of the classic consoles that you can bring it to a friend's house.
Maybe, yeah.
But I just feel if they're not doing this, then I think that's a huge oversight, and I read something wrong. But having those classic multiplayer games, like I would love to play like Super Mario Brothers or Super Mario like 3, and take turns playing with a friend online. And because we might not be able to like meet up in person anymore because lives change over time, especially compared to when I was a kid. But having that option, I think, would be really neat.
And I think that's where the Switch Online program comes into play on the Nintendo side, because you know the Switch Online program gives you the free NES games every month, and those do have online capability.
Yeah.
And I think Nintendo knew ahead of time that they were going to do something like that with the Switch, and that's probably why they didn't incorporate any kind of like online multiplayer connectivity with the classic consoles, because the classic consoles were purely for the aesthetic of getting a retro console preloaded with a bunch of games. That's what that really was. Whereas if you want to play these games online, they wanted to make sure that you were getting a Switch and subscribing.
Yeah, and that makes sense as a company, but it also kind of feels like you're shooting your other product in the foot and drastically reducing its shelf life.
Yeah, maybe a little bit.
Just because, like, if like what was it? I think the Wii U Virtual Console had a lot of great titles, and I would love to see those migrated over to the Twitch. And there's a bunch of other games that I would love to. Right, sorry, to the Switch. All of my switches and twitches are getting mixed. But I would love to see a lot of those titles getting implemented into like the Switch and the modern consoles and things that you could get on their eShops at an affordable price. That's the caveat, is an affordable price.
Which on the Virtual Console they usually weren't.
Yeah.
They were usually kind of pricey, which actually they did it in a very interesting way, because what they did was if you migrated your data from the Wii to the Wii U, what they would do is, if you wanted to get the Wii U version of that Virtual Console game, of a game that you already bought on the Wii, you would still have to purchase it, but instead of paying $10 for it, you would pay like $1.50. So like they made it stupid cheap for you since you already bought it.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I come in as a video game collector, is like, I've already bought these games. Why do I have to get another one?
Yeah, which is why I think a lot of people were upset that they dropped the Virtual Console. You know, the Virtual Console was a nice thing. I get why they got rid of it.
But it's just, I don't feel like these video game developers have fully considered what they want to do with their backlog of video games. And that's the biggest thing that we're kind of in a weird limbo, is like, do we want to get a bunch of remakes and remasters and update everything to where it looks more modern and may lose some of its original charm to, you know, integrate them into the modern, you know, video game base. But if they're working on just updating their old library, we're not getting as many new games and pushing the edge of what we know as video games as today. But then do we want to just have a database of video games that you can go back and play, but they need to be at an affordable price, and also then be updated, like you were saying with the Wii U? Those games are no longer on the Switch, so there's no compatibility to move these games, so then that necessitates you having a amalgamation of multiple game consoles that have had eShops that you've downloaded stuff for.
Yeah, and that's like, I love the Switch. It's probably one of my favorite consoles of all time now, but I really hope that they up their game in terms of the classic game offerings. Because, okay, the NES library through Switch Online, cool. Let's get some SNES in there. Let's get some N64. And more importantly, GameCube. For crying out loud, where have the fucking GameCube games gone? Come on, Nintendo. People have been asking you for this.
Yeah, the GameCube games haven't really gotten a lot of love.
They really haven't. Like there's, if you want to play Super Mario Sunshine, you got to play the original GameCube copy. There's no way to do it on a retro system. A retro system, sorry.
That
modern
game
system.
Still looks beautiful to this day, in my opinion.
I still love that game. I still want to do it on Rogues. I still want to, but that's a different topic. But I think that the retro console craze, like the little classic retro console craze, is a little bit of a fad. But I think the aesthetic there is just, hey, you're getting a tiny little portable console that has a lot of classic games preloaded on it that you can, you know, play some classic games with added features.
The biggest thing I can say for it is it's convenient.
Yeah, exactly. It's convenient. Like if you're like, because like you as a person who has your big library of games over there, you don't really have a reason to get one of these retro consoles. But somebody who doesn't have any of that stuff, but they want those games back, that's an easy way for them to get those games back without paying a huge price.
Exactly. And and that's the thing, is that it's a weird middle ground between the two that it kind of settles into. But that's why it is also kind of in a weird limbo state as to like, where do these classic consoles fit into the bigger scheme of their game library? Yeah.
And I think that Nintendo had the right idea where, you know, they have the Switch coming out, but they still have the retro consoles coming out to kind of coexist alongside it, because Nintendo knew that there were going to be people who would not be interested in a new Nintendo console, but probably would be interested in getting a retro system that had all these games from their childhood on it. You know,
and it sounds like the classic consoles were definitely catering to an older audience that grew up with the classic Nintendo system. So
exactly,
and so not necessarily like the younger generations that like the 3DS and the Switch might appeal to a little bit more.
Exactly. So I love the idea of these retro consoles. It's definitely made playing Super Nintendo a lot easier for me.
It's interesting.
It's definitely interesting. I mean, if they come out with an N64 Classic, I'll be all over that. But it's not going to replace my N64 just because there's N64 games that I still want to play whenever I can that won't be on the N64
so
Classic.
it's just they're not a substitute, but they do act as, I think, a good entry to some of these classic titles.
Exactly. So they make for exactly, you said it exactly.
It's essentially
an entry point.
Classic consoles are like the gateway to
retro gaming,
the retro gaming sphere, which there's tons and tons of retro video game collectors. I consider myself a little bit of one, although I know there are people with even much more vast libraries of
oh god, the most
games.
The first example that comes to my mind is the Angry Video Game Nerd. Have you seen his game collection? It's insane.
Just because I didn't know until a few years ago that there was variants on the back of NES cartridges in terms of like how many screws they used to hold it in.
Oh wow.
Apparently there's 4-screw versions and 5-screw versions, and I'm just like, that's a little too much retro collecting for me. But I just, because I collect video games to play them. I don't collect them to hoard them off into a little sequester and preserve their value. I buy video games so I can play them as, like you said earlier, as they were intended.
Exactly. And that's the whole reason why I would buy a retro gaming console or a retro game in general is to play them. That's the whole reason why I would
they give you a very true representation of what the classic experience would be, because it is the original game and you're playing it on the original controller. The only thing is now it works smoother with modern televisions and equipment.
Yep, exactly. So I think that's where the appeal of these classic consoles are. That being said, I still want retro games on my Switch. I want it really bad.
And I think that they're working on getting something like that rolled out, because with the online plans they launched it's like 20 NES games or
and you get like 3 more NES games every month.
Now, is that going to be a rolling library? Like they'll shift some in and some out, or is that just they're going to keep adding?
They just keep adding.
Okay.
They just keep adding. And I do think I honestly, I'll be completely shocked if they don't start adding more retro gaming consoles to the lineup, like the Super Nintendo and the N64. I will be amazed if they don't do that, because first of all, the SNES Classic, because it's already been confirmed that the a lot of the ROMs that they're using for the NES library on Switch Online are the exact same ROMs that they use for the NES Classic, and Nintendo apparently designed it to make it very easy for them to add different ROMs in there. They already have the SNES ROMs.
Yeah.
All they need to do is put them in and just, maybe make some tweaks, and you got SNES.
Yeah.
It's like, I'll be amazed if they don't do that.
So let me ask you this then. Do you think that, because this is something that if I was a big game developer like Nintendo and PlayStation and Xbox, do you think there is more or less or equal to interest in classic games than newer games?
That's an excellent question and a very interesting one, because it's still kind of catering to different audiences in a way, because there's still plenty of people who like both, but a lot of people like retro more than modern, or some people just don't care about retro at all.
Because it's just, as a developer, you have to consider, I have to shift resources to programmers and artists to make sure that these classic games get, remade or ported correctly. But that would shift labor away from potentially making newer games. So do you, as a developer, think there's enough interest to have somebody go and revamp these older games as opposed to just going full throttle on new titles?
I think there is, because because the NES Classic and SNES Classic showed us that there actually is a lot of interest from people to want to get these systems and play the retro games. Like, I know a lot of people were buying them specifically to collect them, but like even the NES Classic, it's still selling right now, even though it's not like the NES Classic used to be like a really collectible item because it was hard to get, but now it's so easy to get one, and people are still buying them because they want to play the games, you know. And the SNES Classic is still popular because people love the Super Nintendo. Like, I still think that there's plenty enough of a market out there for classic games to put resources towards getting these classic games into a more modern form, you know.
And that's something that I would really like game developers to do, is just to have like maybe a small division of people. Like I know Retro Studios, they actually make new games based on classic formats. But I would like just a small group of people, and their job is to essentially maintain and curate these antique video game libraries and keep them updated to the current system, so then that way they can still be enjoyed and shared. And then, you know, just it's almost like a museum curator takes care of artifacts.
Yeah, and I think that to a degree they kind of do that, because I think Nintendo does like sort of outsource some of these classic game ports to some degree. Because I mean, they got to make sure that a lot of their in-house development teams are working on the new stuff. There's a lot of stuff that Nintendo has to outsource. Like, I know with a lot of even their newer games, they outsource like Super Smash Brothers. Nintendo is outsourcing a lot of development to Namco Bandai for the Smash Brothers games. Like Smash 4 was basically developed by Namco Bandai and was directed by Sakurai. So, I mean, it's not out of the ordinary for Nintendo to outsource. I'm sure they're doing the same thing with the retro games.
Yeah, and I don't know what the developers are doing with their, you know, antique video game libraries, but I do know is that there are still tons and tons and tons of classic games that have not made it into the modern sphere, and you can only get them in their original form.
Yeah, and that's where an issue can come into play. But then again, a lot of these games that get brought up are not particularly hugely popular games. Like, for example, I mean, I would love to be able to, and again, I'm going to go back to Glover again. I know a lot of people see Glover as kind of like a mediocre or bad game, but I'm sorry, I personally liked it. I love that. I have a lot of fun with that game. But I mean, and I would love to see Glover on a more modern system. And it's never going to happen because it's not a very popular title. It's not a game that a whole lot of people really know about. And I don't even know if the developer behind that game is even around anymore. Like, I have no idea.
And it's just, for me, it's just like, you would probably see somebody revamp the original Ninja Gaiden game and, you know, refurbish that into a modern, like, classic console. But you wouldn't see a game like Samurai Pizza Cats.
Yeah.
And you're just comparing.
That sounds amazing, by the way.
I would love to try and track down a copy, but I think it was Japanese only. But just, you know, comparing something like that in terms of, like, you know, how valuable is that to a game developer? So, but it's just like, for me, I personally want to try and treat all of my archive of games equally, because they were all at one point or another equal in value.
Yeah, and as much as it's awesome that these developers really try to retain their history as much as they possibly can, it's very difficult for them to retain, like, all or even most of their history, because there's so many games out there that have been made and released, and these companies just completely sorry, I had a hiccup. These companies just completely forget about them, or they get lost in the ether. And it's almost impossible to get these games and their rights back for a number of reasons. That's where I think the emulation community comes into play.
It was like a fan-made archive.
Yeah, and that's why I think so many people are getting mad about Nintendo going after these emulation sites, because...
But if you think about it, if they're planning to do a massive classic game overhaul, then getting rid of the sources that are technically illegally distributing the software, it makes a lot of sense as a business move.
Yeah, again, like I totally understand why Nintendo does it. It's just that's one of those issues where I see the argument from both sides. It's
Yeah,
like, on one hand, I see where the emulator people in the emulator community are coming from. They want to preserve video game history, and there's so many games out there that you can't play without emulating them. It's just not possible to play them without emulating them, either because the copies of that game just no longer exist, or it's just so damn hard to get your hand on an original copy,
or it's region locked,
so people emulate them. So I get it. I understand the mindset from the emulator's standpoint, because they want to preserve that history. But on the flip side, it is technically illegal, and Nintendo does technically have the right to make sure that you're not publishing their games without their permission. And Nintendo wants to make sure that they're retaining their market for getting those retro games out there, because Nintendo wants to preserve their history as much as they possibly can as well, and they have to do it from a legal standpoint because they're a company. So I see the argument from both sides, and I sympathize with both sides. For me, it's kind of a gray area. It's like I sympathize with both sides of the party.
Yeah, I understand where they're coming from, but there's one last question I wanted to pose to you, and this was something that I think with the PlayStation Classic being announced is, do you think it is too soon for CD-based game systems to be considered retro?
So that you actually asked me that question earlier today, and it's actually a really interesting question.
Because for me personally, I consider anything that was a cartridge-based system, so like the N64 and before, as a retro console.
So let me put it to you this way. What's considered retro is based on... It's not really based on the tech behind them, but more when they came out, and where they fall in line with that classic lineup. So if
kind of like when does a song get considered an oldie?
Right. So if you're going to consider the N64 as a retro console, then that automatically makes the PlayStation 1 a retro console, because the PlayStation 1 came out first.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah, I guess it did.
The PlayStation 1 came out in 1994. The N64 came out in 1996.
Oh, well, there we go.
So if the N64 is retro, then so is the PS1.
Okay, well, that makes my argument invalid.
So now, to go into more of the territory that I think you were trying to go towards, I think we're starting to teeter on that edge of later consoles starting to become retro. Like, I personally don't feel that the GameCube and PS2 and original Xbox are technically retro. I personally can't classify them as retro just yet. But I think if you give it maybe a few more years, I think we could probably consider them to be retro.
Yeah. And I think part of the reason that it's so skewed for me is that I regularly go back and play my PS2 and GameCube games and other things, so it's just they don't feel as retro to me because I still go back and play those games regularly.
Yeah, like, because those are systems that, when I think of retro games, I think of the games that I played when I was in my single-digit years of life. Whereas the PS2 and GameCube, that was during my double-digit, early teenage years. Like when I was 11 years old, 12 years old, and onward. And, that was a really good time for gaming, for sure. But it is a little... I definitely have to say I somewhat agree with you to a degree there, that it's very difficult for me to consider the GameCube and the PS2 retro. I think that we're starting to go into that territory where they can be considered retro. But for me personally, to me, I feel like they're more of just a big piece of my childhood.
Yeah.
More so than actually being retro. But I would probably say, like, give it maybe like 5 more years and then let the next generation of consoles come out. And then at that point, I'll probably say, you know what? I would probably classify them as retro at that point.
I'm always curious if, like, people are going to start considering, like, the PS2 and that kind of stuff retro, if they're going to have a whiplash thing and then start going with like, well, then the NES and the SNES are antiques.
Yeah. Well, that it's going to get to that point at some point. Yeah. So I mean, but who knows what could happen with that? I mean, like it's any whenever you get into the PS2 and GameCube era, the problem with trying to classify them as retro for me is that was when you started to see more of like, because 3D was like the big revolution of gaming.
Yeah.
Like the transition from 2D to 3D. That was like the big revolution of gaming. And I think the best way I can describe how I personally see as a retro system is like, where does it fall in line during the time of 2D to 3D transition? And the GameCube and PS2 era is where that's like that ground of like the end of the transition. That was when the transition was coming to a close.
Yeah.
And we were fully into the 3D era.
Yeah, 3D was well established, even if the models were still getting more polished over time.
Exactly. So like that's why I have a hard time considering PS2 and GameCube as retro, mainly due to the fact that the games, like that was the end of the 2D to 3D transition, and we were fully in the 3D age at that point, which is the 3D age is where we're at now, and it's likely to stay for pretty much forever.
But you do still have developers like the Octopath Traveler is a game that we are actually actively playing.
Yeah,
and it's like it's a throwback to that
exactly
2D style.
It's a throwback to that style, and like, you know what? That's a perfect example, because think about it. When you think of a throwback to a retro style, you think of something like Octopath Traveler,
yeah,
where it's 2D. It's very difficult to have a throwback to the GameCube and PS2 era.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to do that. Like, heck, even the N64, I honestly wouldn't want a throwback to that, because although the graphics were great for the time, they aren't anymore.
Yeah, and Yooka-Laylee is kind of showing that, because it was supposed to be a throwback to like Banjo-Kazooie on the N64, and it had its successes and failures.
Yeah, what I wanted to see from Yooka-Laylee was a successor to Banjo-Kazooie, but an evolution of the formula, which that's not really what they did. They just stuck to the formula exactly without really any change.
Yeah.
And that really hurt it.
And that's where I kind of feel like the Mega Man franchise is in kind of a bit of a limbo right now.
Yeah, which is why I think, A Hat in Time, in my opinion, was a far better return to 3D platforming than Yooka-Laylee was, because it took that formula and evolved it. And A Hat in Time was like, it felt like a fresh take on that genre. So like, I mean, if you're going to go back to like that lost 3D platformer genre from the N64 era, you have to redefine it somehow.
Yeah.
It's okay, cool, you're going back to that genre, but you got to do something new with it. You know what I mean? And that's what I felt A Hat in Time did versus Yooka-Laylee, which Yooka-Laylee stuck too close to just trying to be an N64 game.
Yeah. There's a difference between making something your own and cloning something.
Which, actually, I just thought of this, because the N64 graphical style is starting to become like an attractive selling point, because I know with A Hat in Time, there have been, I think the developer actually put out like a graphical swap for it, where you can actually change the, I can't remember 100% how they implemented this. I can't remember if it was just HackKid by itself or the whole game, but they actually implemented this mode where you can actually swap the graphics to look more like an N64 game.
Oh, wow.
And people actually love it. It's just like, are we really starting to go into that territory where people want to see more games that look blocky like that?
Low poly?
Like low poly graphics. Like that would, you know what? If that started to become a thing, I would be on board for that.
Well, I mean, if you like, what was that game? Super Hot. I mean, technically, all of the models in that game were low poly.
Yeah.
So it's just we're in this weird shift of what people perceive as good and bad of like design and like modeling and art. And it's it's interesting to see how all of it has evolved over time, because like if I go back and play GoldenEye, it's just like ah. But then if you go to like the Spider-Man game that was just released on the PS4,
Yeah.
there was those people on the boats that people discovered where they looked like they were ripped right out of like a PS1. And so
Is that real?
yes, I'll have to show you a picture. I think Taylor has it, but yeah, some people found some like people actually went far enough out of the game. They found people on boats and they look like they were ripped out of a PS1.
I mean, if it's outside of the area where you're supposed to be accessing, I can understand that. They kept it low poly to keep the resources low.
Yeah, but
it's like, they're far away enough to where it looks good.
You still have stuff like that popping up in modern games.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see how everything is now like blending together.
Yeah.
In a weird, like, it gives indie developers, I think, a lot of creative freedom to choose whatever art style or genre that they really, really want to build in, and there is a group of people that will be receptive to it.
Actually, I just thought of something, because one of my favorite games of all time now is the original Xenoblade Chronicles on the Wii.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I just got done talking about how like the PS2 and GameCube graphical styles can't really feel retro. But I now that I think about that game, I'm starting to eat my words, because when I started playing Xenoblade Chronicles, I remember when I first started playing it, I immediately started feeling like I was playing like a PS2 game, because the thing about it was on the Wii, so it had GameCube graphics, and I remember thinking, oh my god, I feel like I'm playing like an old school PlayStation 2 RPG. This is actually really cool. So I'm starting to like eat my own words now. Like, am I actually starting to go into that territory where that PS2 style of RPG with the way the graphics look is actually starting to feel retro? Like, are we going there now?
What's happening?
So, I mean, I don't know. Like, I guess we're starting to transition from, you know, that age where only 2D games are seen as retro. But now we're starting to transition into like, you know, seeing like those art styles from earlier 3D games is starting to feel more retro too.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
So let's go ahead and start wrapping this up. Is there anything else you wanted to cover on like classic consoles?
Not really. I mean, I'm glad that I think they're a cool idea, and I think that there's definitely a lot of appeal for them.
Yeah, I definitely feel like there's a market for them, but you have to know what you're getting.
Yeah, and I think for people who are big collectors, it's probably less value for them. But for people who aren't big collectors and they just want to play the games,
it's a great entry point. Yeah,
exactly. It's a great entry point, and yeah.
All right. So thank you for joining us, everybody. Let us know in the comments below what you consider a retro console.
Yeah, what's your definition of retro gaming? Like what would you say is like the latest addition to the console lineup that you would consider retro?
Mm-hmm.
You know, because like some people don't even consider N64 retro.
Yeah,
which I personally disagree with. But hey, some people have different opinions.
And also, I would like to know is, do you think that the early days of 3D low poly is actually an art style of its own now, or something that should be left in the dust?
I mean, actually, if I saw a developer implement that as an art style, I would probably be down with it.
Mm-hmm.
I would actually probably be down with it. It's like, oh my god, it looks like an N64 game. This is actually pretty. As long as it's intentional, I would be down with it.
Yeah, you'd have to deliberately use that style of animation or modeling and coloring. And
Yeah.
I think the coloring would be the big thing in the way you render it.
Yeah, so as long as it's intentional, I would personally be down with that coming back as an art style.
But let us know what you think in the comments below, and we'll see y'all next time. Thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.